The chapel doors slammed shut just as Jungkook caught Jimin's trembling hand, pulled him into the shadows behind the altar, and whispered against his ear, "Marry me before they tear us apart." Rain battered the stained glass windows hard enough to sound like thrown stones, and somewhere beyond the locked doors voices rose in anger, sharp, frantic, merciless. Jimin could hear them even through the storm. The pounding fists, the muffled shouting, the sound of his name being spoken like an accusation. Jimin's breath snagged in his throat. For one suspended second, the world narrowed to the warmth of Jungkook's hand around his wrist and the impossible steadiness in his voice. "Jungkook," Jimin whispered, barely able to force the name past his lips. "Do you even hear what you're saying?" Jungkook's eyes held his with terrifying certainty, dark, rainlit, unwavering. There was mud on the hem of his black coat, blood on one knuckle, and desperation tucked so deep beneath his calm that only Jimin knew where to find it. Jungkook said, "I've never meant anything more." Lightning flashed through the chapel glass, washing the room in fractured blue and crimson. For a heartbeat, Jungkook looked less like a man and more like a vow dragged into flesh, beautiful, furious, and already halfway ruined by love. Jimin stared at him, chest tight. This was how it had always been with Jungkook. Not gentle, not careful, never ordinary. A year ago, Jungkook had kissed him in the middle of an empty parking lot with blood on his lip and rain in his hair after a fight he refused to explain. 6 months ago, he had shown up outside Jimin's apartment at 3 in the morning, silent and shaking, and fallen asleep on Jimin's floor without taking off his shoes. 3 weeks ago, he had stood across a crowded room full of people who smiled too politely and looked at Jimin as if he were already losing him. And now Jungkook was asking him to burn the rest of his life down. Another violent bang rattled the chapel doors. "Open this door." Jimin flinched. The voice was unmistakable. His father, even muffled by wood and storm, the sound of it sent something cold and ancient through his spine. Jimin had spent his entire life learning the shape of fear in that voice. It was measured, controlled, elegant. His father never needed to shout to be terrifying, but tonight there was fury in it, real fury, the kind that stripped a man down to what he truly was. Jimin turned instinctively toward the doors. Jungkook caught his jaw, turning his face back. He said, low and urgent, "Don't look at them, look at me." Jimin did. That was always the problem. He always did. Jungkook's hand slid from Jimin's face to the side of his neck, thumb pressing against his pulse as if trying to memorize its rhythm. His touch was warm, grounding, achingly familiar. Jimin hated how easily his body recognized safety in the very person who had made his life impossible. Outside, thunder cracked so violently the candles flickered. Inside, the air smelled like wet stone, old wood, and wax. "Say yes," Jungkook whispered. Jimin laughed then, a fractured, disbelieving sound edged with panic. "You're insane, probably. My father will destroy you. He's been trying. My family will bury this," gave him a grim smile. "Then let them dig." Jimin's heart twisted with such brutal force he almost mistook it for pain. This was what no one understood about Jungkook. People saw the polished edges first. The poise, the impossible charm, the smile sharp enough to disarm a room. They saw wealth, discipline, reputation. They saw a man impossible to shake. They never saw what Jimin saw. The restless tapping of Jungkook's fingers when he was afraid. The way he rolled his sleeves when he was angry enough to become reckless. The sleeplessness he hid behind expensive watches and practiced smiles. The private brutality of being loved only when he was useful. Jimin knew the loneliness Jungkook wore like tailored silk. He knew because he wore his own. "Why now?" Jimin asked, voice barely audible. Jungkook looked at him for a long moment, and something in his expression changed. The urgency remained, but beneath it was something older, sadder, a truth carried too long in silence. "Because tonight is the last night they'll let us choose anything for ourselves." The words landed like a blade. Jimin went still, and there it was. The truth he had spent weeks refusing to name. Tonight was not just another threat, not another warning dressed as concern, not another elegant dinner where families traded futures over wine while pretending love was a childish inconvenience. Tonight was the end of delay. Tomorrow, Jimin was expected to announce an engagement arranged so long ago it had begun to feel like inheritance instead of violence. A merger disguised as marriage. A future negotiated by men who had never once asked what he wanted. And Jungkook was meant to stand beside him and smile through it, because Jungkook's family had their own bargains to keep, because love in their world was ornamental at best and catastrophic at worst. Because men like them were allowed desire only as rumor, never as devotion. Jimin stepped back and Jungkook let him, though the loss of contact seemed to tighten every line of his body. "You should have asked me sooner," Jimin said, voice unsteady. A flicker crossed Jungkook's face. Regret, sharp and immediate. I know, Jimin swallowed hard. Years sooner. Jungkook's breath left him in something like pain, the silence between them filled with everything they had never said. The first time they met, Jimin had been 19 and too angry to be charming. Jungkook had been all sharp edges and dangerous composure, standing in a room full of inherited power like he had been born knowing exactly how to survive it. Jimin had hated him instantly for how effortless he seemed. Later, he learned effortless was just another kind of performance. They had spent years orbiting each other like a private disaster. Too much pride, too much fear, too many eyes watching. They learned each other in fragments. Jimin learned that Jungkook drank coffee too bitter and slept with the television on to drown out silence. Jungkook learned Jimin counted under his breath when anxious and pressed his thumbnail into his palm when trying not to cry. Jimin learned Jungkook collected old lighters he never used. Jungkook learned Jimin hated being touched when startled but leaned into it when tired. They learned restraint before they ever learned honesty. And by the time honesty came, it came too late, or maybe not. Another crash thundered through the chapel, the wood groaned. "They're coming in," Jimin whispered. Jungkook stepped closer again, close enough that Jimin could feel the heat of him despite the cold. "Then answer me before they do." Jimin searched his face, he saw fear there now. Real fear, not of scandal, not of ruin, of losing him. It stripped something raw open inside Jimin. He thought of every silence that had cost them years, every almost, every interrupted confession, every look held too long and abandoned too soon. He thought of the life waiting outside these chapel walls, beautiful, sterile, obedient, dead on arrival. He thought of Jungkook standing in front of him like a man offering not salvation but choice. It terrified him. It felt like freedom. Jimin's eyes burned. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough to be mistaken for prayer. "Yes." Stared at him unmoving, as if he had prepared himself for every outcome except mercy. Then something in him broke open, not visibly, not loudly, but Jimin felt it in the way Jungkook exhaled, in the way his hands trembled once before he caught Jimin's face and kissed him like the world outside had already ended. It was not a gentle kiss. It was rain and ruin and relief. Years of restraint collapsed inside it. All the words they had starved, all the fear they had fed instead of feeling. Jimin tasted salt and storm and the sharp edge of Jungkook's breath, and for one impossible moment the pounding outside disappeared. There was only this, only him, only the man who had asked for forever with blood on his hand and thunder at his back. The chapel doors splintered, the sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Jimin tore back just as the first hinge gave way, voices flooded the threshold. Men in dark coats. Familiar faces twisted into outrage. Family, reputation, legacy, arriving all at once to drag them back into the lives chosen for them. Jimin's father stepped through the broken doorway like judgment made flesh. His gaze landed on them, on Jungkook's hand still at Jimin's waist, on Jimin's mouth still kissed red. Silence struck the room, the kind that came before violence. Jimin had feared this moment for years, the discovery, the namming, the end of concealment. But standing there with Jungkook's heartbeat still echoing against his own, fear no longer felt like the sharpest thing in him. His father's face hardened with a fury so complete it became cold. Step away from him. Felt Jungkook shift beside him, readying for impact, for consequence, for war. But before Jungkook could move, Jimin reached for his hand and held it openly in the center of the ruined chapel. The gasp that followed was immediate, horrified, irreversible. Jimin lifted his chin, rainlight cutting across his face like a blade, and for the first time in his life when he spoke to his father, his voice did not shake.
The word fell into the chapel with more force than thunder. No, it did not echo. It did not need to. It struck the room cleanly, sharply, and left a silence so complete that even the rain seemed to hesitate against the shattered, stained glass. Jimin had said many things in his father's presence over the years. "Yes, father, of course. I understand. Whatever you think is best, never this, never no." His father stood motionless beneath the ruined archway, rain at his shoulders, fury held so tightly beneath his skin it made him look carved from ice. Men in dark coats crowded behind him, all polished shoes and expensive restraint, but no one moved. No one breathed too loudly. No one was foolish enough to interrupt what had just happened. Jimin still held Jungkook's hand. That, more than anything, seemed to offend the room. Not the kiss. Not the confession. Not the audacity of what they had done in a chapel meant for sanctified promises. It was the hand. The simple, devastating intimacy of it. Jimin could feel the tension in Jungkook's fingers, ready, restrained, dangerous. Jungkook had gone unnaturally still beside him, his silence the kind that came before impact. Jimin knew that silence. He had seen it before broken glass, before blood, before the exact moment Jungkook stopped enduring and started destroying. So Jimin tightened his grip once, a warning. Not yet. His father's gaze dropped to their joined hands, then lifted slowly to Jimin's face. "You will let go of him," he said. His voice was calm again. That was worse. Jimin had been raised on that voice. It was the voice that decided consequences over breakfast. The voice that ruined lives in measured tones and called it discipline. His father did not shout when he was certain he would win. Jimin felt the old fear rise in him by instinct, cold and immediate, but it collided with something hotter now. Something exhausted, something done bleeding quietly, Jimin said again. The second refusal landed harder than the first. Behind his father, someone shifted. A breath caught. One of the men near the doorway looked down, as if eye contact itself had become dangerous. Jimin's father took one step forward. Jungkook moved at once, half a step in front of Jimin without breaking their grip. It was subtle, instinctive, protective. Jimin saw his father notice it, and something in the older man's expression changed, not surprise exactly, recognition. As if this, more than anything, confirmed the depth of what stood in front of him. Not scandal, not rebellion, attachment. That was the unforgivable part. His father's eyes settled on Jungkook with surgical contempt. "You," he said quietly. "I expected ambition from your family. Opportunism, certainly. But this..." Jungkook's voice, when it came, was cool enough to frost the air. "If you think this is ambition, then you've never loved anyone in your life." The room changed, not loudly, not visibly, but Jimin felt it like a wire pulled too tight. His father smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "I was willing to overlook your proximity to my son as youthful indulgence," he said. "I was willing to be discreet, but you mistake tolerance for permission." Felt Jungkook's shoulders tense. He knew that look in Jungkook too, the one that came just before he said something reckless enough to redraw the room. So Jimin stepped forward first, forcing himself beside him. "You don't get to call this indulgence." His father's gaze cut to him. Jimin kept speaking, because if he stopped now, he might never start again. "You don't get to reduce every feeling you can't control into weakness. You don't get to decide what this is because it's inconvenient for you." The words were out before fear could strangle them. They tasted like blood and freedom. His father stared at him with a stillness so absolute it became terrifying. Jimin knew this expression. He had seen it turned on board members, journalists, relatives who had mistaken proximity for safety. It was the face his father wore before he erased people. "You are speaking emotionally," his father said. "That has always been your worst habit." Almost laughed. There it was, the oldest wound, the easiest knife. As if feeling too much had always been a flaw instead of the only reason he had survived this family at all, Jimin lifted his chin. "And you've always mistaken numbness for strength." Silence that followed was catastrophic. One of the men behind his father looked physically ill. Jungkook's hand tightened around Jimin so hard it almost hurt. Not to stop him, to steady him. His father went very still. Then quietly he said, "You will come home." Looked at the man who had shaped his life with expectation, polished him into obedience, taught him how to smile while disappearing by inches. For years, Jimin had mistaken fear for loyalty. Now, in the wreckage of a chapel with rain soaking the floor and Jungkook at his side, he saw the difference with devastating clarity. "Home," he thought. "What an elegant word for captivity," Jimin said. His father's restraint cracked. It was small, barely visible, a tightening at the jaw, a pulse in his temple. But Jimin saw it because he had spent a lifetime studying the fault lines in powerful men. His father turned to Jungkook. "This ends tonight." Jungkook did not blink. "It doesn't." "It does." His father's voice sharpened. "You will walk away now, and if you are very fortunate, I may allow your family to survive the fallout of your mistake." It was, not anger, leverage, always leverage. Jimin felt Jungkook go still beside him in a way that frightened him more than rage. Because this was the wound no one saw in Jungkook, not fear for himself, fear for the people who could be broken because of him. Jimin turned his head. Jungkook's face had changed, not outwardly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but Jimin saw the fracture instantly. The hesitation, the calculation, the old conditioning pressing its hand over his throat. Jimin knew that look because he had worn it too, the look of someone taught young that love was expensive and someone else would always pay for it. His father saw it too and smiled, cruel, precise, victorious. He had found the pressure point. Jungkook, his father said almost gently now, be sensible. Felt the shift in the room, the tilt. The trap narrowing. This was how men like his father won, not through force, through fear dressed as reason. Jungkook's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked once to Jimin, and Jimin saw it there. The unbearable split opening inside him. Stay and risk destruction, leave and survive it. Jimin's heart lurched. Not because he doubted Jungkook loved him, because he knew exactly what love looked like when it had been taught to kneel before sacrifice. Jimin stepped in front of him before the silence could become surrender. He doesn't answer to you. His father's gaze snapped to him. Jimin's pulse thundered, but his voice came clear. You think this is still a negotiation? It isn't. Jimin. No. His voice cut through the room like glass. You've spent my entire life deciding what can be bought, arranged, buried, traded, my future, my name, my silence, but not this. His chest rose sharply. He could hear his own heartbeat, violent and alive, not him. Something moved across his father's face then, not anger, something colder, something almost like disappointment. You would throw away everything. Looked at him and understood with sudden terrible clarity that this was the closest his father would ever come to asking, do you mean it? Jimin answered with the truth. The word landed without tremor. And perhaps that was what made his father finally understand this was no longer disobedience. It was departure. His expression emptied. When he spoke again, his voice had gone terrifyingly flat. Then you are no longer my son. The sentence should have broken something. It had lived in Jimin's nightmares too long not to. He had feared it as a child, as a teenager, as a man exiled, disinheritance, severance, the final punishment, but standing in the cold wreckage of the chapel, hand in Jungkook. Jimin felt the words hit him and pass clean through. Pain, yes, grief, certainly, but beneath it, relief. A breath left him, thin and shaking and years overdue. His father saw it, saw the absence of collapse. And for the first time that night, something dangerously close to uncertainty entered his face. Jimin met his gaze. Then, with rain blowing through the broken chapel and every witness in the room holding their breath, Jimin lifted Jungkook's hand to his mouth and pressed a kiss to his bruised knuckles. Not hidden, not ashamed, a visible vow. The sound that moved through the room was small and horrified. Jimin did not look away. His father stared at him for one long, unreadable second. Then he turned. No final warning. No raised voice. No spectacle. Just a cold, precise retreat more threatening than rage. The men behind him followed at once, dark coats vanishing into rain. Within seconds the doorway was empty. Only storm remained. Only broken glass. Only the trembling aftermath of survival. Jimin stood motionless, pulse roaring in his ears, staring at the place his father had been as the reality of what had just happened began to arrive in fragments. He had done it. He had chosen. And there was no life left to return to. The silence that followed was immense. Then Jungkook exhaled. It was not relief. It was something far more dangerous. Jimin turned. Jungkook was staring at the ruined doorway with an expression Jimin knew too well, still, distant, already calculating impact. What are you thinking? Jimin asked quietly. Jungkook dragged a hand over his mouth, rain and exhaustion and adrenaline making him look suddenly, brutally young. That your father doesn't leave rooms he intends to lose. The words sank cold into Jimin's chest. The storm pressed harder against the broken chapel windows, and somewhere beyond the rain, far down the dark road below, headlights began to gather. The first car appeared through the rain like a blade cutting open the dark. Then another. Then three more behind it, headlights stretching across the wet road below the chapel in a slow, deliberate procession. White beams slid over the iron gates, over stone walls blackened by weather, over the rain-slick gravel path winding toward them like a vein. Jimin moved to the broken doorway, breath catching as the convoy climbed the hill. Not police, worse, black sedans, familiar, silent, expensive enough to look harmless from a distance, his father's favorite kind of threat. Jimin felt Jungkook step beside him, close enough for their shoulders to touch. He came prepared, Jimin said, the words thin in his own ears. Jungkook didn't answer immediately. Rain blew through the shattered chapel, dampening his hair, darkening the collar of his coat. He looked down the hill with that same terrible stillness, measuring exits, counting timing, calculating how quickly a disaster could become fatal. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. He didn't come to take you home. Knew that? He knew it in the way the cars moved. Too precise, too controlled, no panic, no urgency, men arriving not to retrieve but to contain. His pulse turned sharp. The chapel sat high on the hill, old and beautiful and catastrophically exposed. One road in, one road out, dense forest to the east, cliffs behind the graveyard. Rain turning the stone paths slick enough to break a neck, a romantic place to be married, an excellent place to disappear. Jimin's mouth went dry. Jungkook was already moving. He crossed the chapel in long, quick strides, scanning windows, exits, shadows. Jimin followed, the cold catching in his lungs. What are we doing? Leaving. Jungkook's tone was clipped now, stripped down to instinct. He crouched near the side entrance, a narrow service door half hidden behind rotting velvet drapes, and tested the rusted handle. Locked. Jungkook stepped back and drove his shoulder into it hard enough to rattle the frame. Wood groaned. On the second hit, the lock split. Cold night air rushed in. Jimin stared. You knew that was there. Jungkook glanced at him, breath sharp. I know every exit in any room your father walks into. Something in Jimin's chest twisted. Of course he did. Of course Jungkook had spent years memorizing escape routes in rooms Jimin had been taught to survive politely. The thought struck with such intimate violence, Jimin almost stopped moving. But outside, engines were cutting off one by one, doors opening. Too late for grief. Jungkook caught Jimin's wrist and pulled him through the narrow doorway into the storm. Rain hit like thrown glass. The back of the chapel opened onto an old cemetery, crooked headstones rising from the earth like broken teeth. Water streamed over marble angels and moss-black crosses. The wind smelled like wet stone, pine, and distant seawater from the cliffs below. Jimin's shoes slipped on the soaked path. Jungkook tightened his grip immediately, steadying him without looking back. Careful. They ran, not elegantly, not beautifully. Nothing cinematic left in it now. Jimin's breath tore in his throat as they stumbled through rows of graves, shoes sinking into mud, rain soaking through silk and wool and skin. Branches clawed at Jimin's sleeves. Wet leaves slapped his face. Somewhere below, car doors slammed shut in rapid succession. Voices rose, not shouting yet, orders controlled. Efficient search patterns. Jimin's stomach turned. His father had not brought family. He had brought men. The forest swallowed them quickly. The path dissolved into roots and slick stone, the darkness thick beneath the trees. Rain hammered the canopy overhead, drumming against leaves hard enough to distort sound. Behind them, flashlights began to cut through the cemetery, thin white beams moving between headstones. Jimin nearly slipped again. Jungkook caught him, hand at his waist, breath warm against his ear for one fractured second. Stay with me. The words hit something deep enough to hurt. As if Jimin had ever done anything else. They moved downhill through the trees, fast and blind and half falling. Branches snapped underfoot. Mud climbed Jimin's trousers. His lungs burned. The storm reduced the world to fragments, breath, darkness, wet earth. Jungkook's hand. Another voice cut through the rain behind them. East side. Jimin froze, too close. Jungkook's hand clamped around his arm and dragged him sideways just as a beam of light sliced through the trees ahead. They dropped behind a low ridge of stone and wet roots, bodies pressed into mud and darkness. Jimin could hear them now, 3 men, maybe 4, boots over soaked leaves. Radios crackling low, methodical, not searching, hunting. Jimin's heartbeat pounded so violently he was sure it would give them away. Beside him, Jungkook was utterly still. Rain streamed down his face. His hand covered Jimin's wrist, thumb pressed against the pulse there. Not to quiet it, Jimin realized, to feel it, to make sure it was still there. The flashlight beam swept closer. Jimin stopped breathing. It passed over the ridge once, twice, then moved on. A voice crackled through static. Nothing on the east line. Answered, calm and immediate. Sweep lower. Beam disappeared downhill. Jimin exhaled so sharply it hurt. Jungkook leaned close, mouth near Jimin's ear, voice barely sound. We go west. Nodded. They waited until the footsteps thinned, then moved again. Slower now, bent low through the undergrowth, every step measured against noise. The west side of the hill was steeper, the forest denser. Roots knotted through the earth like traps. Rainwater rushed downhill in narrow streams, turning the slope treacherous. Jimin's body was beginning to fail him in small, humiliating ways. Breath shortening, legs shaking, wet clothes clinging heavy and cold. Jungkook noticed everything he always did. At the base of the slope, half hidden beneath overgrown brush, stood the skeletal remains of an old caretaker's shed. Its roof sagged inward, one window broken. Door hanging loose. Jungkook pulled Jimin inside. The darkness was immediate, close, and smelled of wet wood, rust, and old soil. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. Rain hammered the roof overhead. Jimin bent forward, hands on his knees, trying to drag air back into his lungs. Jungkook shut the door as carefully as the warped frame allowed, then turned. In the dark, his breathing was rougher now too. Controlled, but no longer calm. Jimin pushed wet hair out of his face and laughed once, quiet, disbelieving, almost hysterical. "This is your proposal plan." Jungkook stared at him, then, against all reason, something in his expression cracked. A breath of laughter escaped him too, brief. Wrecked, real, it hit Jimin harder than fear. Because even now, even soaked through, hunted through a forest, futures collapsing by the minute, Jungkook was still trying not to let terror be the only thing between them. Jimin straightened slowly. In the dark, they stood only inches apart. Rain drummed overhead. Their breathing filled the narrow shed. And suddenly, with the chase briefly held at bay, the reality of what had happened rushed in all at once. The chapel, the vow, his father's face, the severing. Jimin looked at Jungkook and felt the full weight of choice settle into his bones, not regret, not yet, but the irreversible shape of consequence. "We really did it," Jimin said softly. Jungkook's gaze held his in the dark. No hesitation. No softening. Just truth. Jimin swallowed. "My father will ruin us." Jungkook stepped closer. Rainwater slid from his hair to his jaw. His voice, when it came, was low enough to feel more than hear. "He'll try." Should have been reassuring, instead it sounded like war. Jimin searched his face, and in the thin wash of stormlight through the broken window, he saw it clearly now. The thing beneath Jungkook's calm, not fear. Resolve, cold, total, dangerous. Jimin knew that look. It was the one Jungkook wore when he had already decided how far he was willing to go. And tonight, Jimin realized with a chill deeper than rain, Jungkook had stopped thinking about escape. He had started thinking about retaliation. "Jungkook," Jimin said carefully. Jungkook's eyes flicked to him. "What did you do before you came to the chapel?" The question changed the air. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Jimin felt it instantly. Jungkook went still, too still. Outside, voices moved somewhere in the dark below the hill. Inside, the silence sharpened. Jimin's pulse slowed with dread. Jungkook did not answer. That was answer enough. Jimin stared at him, rain still dripping from his sleeves onto the warped wooden floor. "What did you do?" Jungkook's jaw tightened. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I made sure your father had something else to lose tonight." Storm broke harder above them. And far beyond the trees, somewhere down the road below, a blast split the dark.